Right, I'd like to welcome everyone tonight to our Friday night Bible study. Our guest speaker tonight will be John Bensinger, who's been here before, and he can give a little uh, introduction to himself and his topic for tonight. So take it away, John.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for Don and the group for letting me join in with y'all. Um, the title is a mouthful: the scriptural, spiritual, and prophetic implication of the dividing of the land of Israel. There's a couple of you here may have heard this before. I did this at the feast in 2018 up in Michigan, I think. But I think it's as relevant today as it was then. And basically, I'm going to talk about why this is so important, why this is actually a signal for prophetic events that are about to come. So to begin, in December of 2016, about exactly 4 years ago, right now, the previous presidential administration under President Obama allowed a condemnation of the nation of Israel at the United Nations when it allowed the UN Security Council Resolution 2334 to pass. Rather than following decades of policy, President Obama couldn't resist one last slap towards Israel and her Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, by allowing the Security Council resolution, which condemned Israel, of course, and offered a boatload of goodies to the Palestinians, including recognition of East Jerusalem as belonging to them, Temple Mount included, to pass unobstructed. This was the first time that any US president allowed such a resolution to pass. But there was concern that the administration was not through because in January of 2017, just prior to President Obama leaving office, there was consideration of another UN Security Council resolution. This one would have set up guidelines for a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians with no negotiations, but just reverting to the pre-67 borders and East Jerusalem as the Palestinian capital. And thankfully, it didn't go through. And why? I think it wasn't in Yah's time. It's obvious that the United States is the only entity that's holding back such an action, but is the United States against the formation of a Palestinian state? The answer is no. The policy of the US has always been that the parties must negotiate final borders, that they must reach an agreement. And that's why it hasn't happened up to this point. But the bigger question for us is, what does Yahweh, the Elohim of Israel, think about this? So again, my topic is the scriptural, spiritual, and prophetic implications of the dividing of the land. And I will say it's a privilege to be here. Like I said, I enjoy being here and sharing, but also listening. And I will say that if anybody's got any input or anything along the way, I've got a lot of territory to cover, but certainly if anybody's got any input or questions, please feel free. So this idea that the Middle East and the land of Israel will be split, and the implications of that, when the nations are seeking to divide the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem through the creation and recognition of a Palestinian state. Now, during the last 4 years under President Trump in office, this steady drumbeat of the Palestinian state was put in the background. Even with all that President Trump did, including recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving to allow Israel to annex certain areas, even with all that, even the Trump plan would have divided the land of Israel. Now, depending on the outcome of the US presidential election, and if Joe Biden becomes president, we could see this shift again. But with all of that, we know from Scripture that there will come a time when the land of Israel will be split, as well as the city of Jerusalem. Because you see, spiritually speaking, this is part of the end time battle between Jacob and Esau. and that it's a bigger battle that is going on between Yahweh and Hasatan. That the battle is over kingship and who is the legitimate firstborn, and whom does the blessing and the inheritance of the firstborn belong. Because the scriptures say that when the nations divide the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem, it's going to bring about the judgment of the nations. It's going to bring about the judgment of the whole earth. And it's going to bring about what is called in the scriptures the Great Tribulation. And so the question is, why is this event so serious and so significant that is going to bring about this judgment upon the whole earth? Why is it going to bring about the Great Tribulation? Why is this such a serious offense when the nations divide the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem? And so the answer, which I will share with you, is because it's part of a bigger picture and a battle that ultimately is between Yahweh and Satan over the issue of kingship and firstborn. You know, a few years ago, I think it was in 2014 and 2015, we had a series of blood red moons that fell on the appointed times or on the feast days. And if we look at the scripture in Joel chapter 2, on verses 30 and 31, we read, "And I shall show wonders in the heavens and in the earth, blood and fire and pillars of smoke. The sun shall turn into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of Yahuwah come." So we're going to have a sign that's in the scriptures given us the coming of the Great Tribulation period and the coming of the end of days, the coming of the day of Yahuwah. And so we have the moon turning to blood red moon. And it's a sign of the great and terrible day of Yahuwah, which is a phraseology for the Great Tribulation. It's also a phraseology which indicates the time of the day of Yahuwah. Now, this phrase, the day of Yahuwah, or the day of the Lord, is an important phrase, and it signifies a time reference. We read in Psalms 90, verse 4, "For 1,000 years in thy sight are as just as yesterday when it is past, and they say, watch in the night." And in 2 Peter 3:8, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with Yahweh as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." So the day that we're referring to is 1,000 years, and it's a day of Yahweh. That the Bible tells us there's going to come a time that is his day. He otherwise called that day the millennium, the messianic era, where he sets up a 1,000-year period where he rules and reigns on the earth. The Messiah rules over the earth, so the scriptures refer to that period as the day of Yahuwah. And we are given signs that that day is approaching. And so one of those signs is the blood red moon. Well, if you studied into this tetrad of the blood red moons, this is not the very first time we've had a tetrad of blood red moons. It's happened before in history. And so when it's happened before in history, did we see the day of Yahuwah arrive? And the answer is, of course, no. And why? Because there are other signs that indicate the day of Yahuwah as well, and we did not see present the other signs that indicated and reveals this day of Yahuwah is at hand. So notice the phrase in Joel chapter 2 and verse 31. It says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and the terrible day of Yahuwah comes." Here's that phrase, "before the great and terrible day of Yahuwah is come." That phrase is used also in Malachi in chapter 4. Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. It says, "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahuwah. And he shall turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse." So we see this same phraseology used, the great and dreadful day or terrible day of Yahuwah. These are two verses that are read, but the verse right before this is left out in Malachi, and it is critical. Let's look at verse 4. Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all of Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh. So Malachi in chapter 4, verse 4 says, remember the Torah of Moses, my servant. Verse 5, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming great and dreadful day of Yahweh. Same phrase. The ministry and the message of Elijah is a sign of the great tribulation and is a sign of the day of Yahweh. That's because, and Yeshua was asked regarding this in Matthew chapter 17, verses 10 through 13, that Elijah and Elijah's ministry will precede the coming of Messiah. Let's take a look at Matthew 17. It says, and his disciples asked him, when they say the scribes that Elijah must first come. And Yeshua answered and said unto them, Elijah truly shall come and restore all things. But I say unto you that Elijah is come already, and they knew him not, but have done unto him whatsoever they listed. Likewise shall also the Son of Man shall suffer of them. Then the disciples understood that he spake of them of John the Baptist. And so since Yahushua had already come, but he's coming again, that at his first coming, John the Baptist, or Yochanan, the immerser, was the one who had the ministry in the spirit and power of Elijah. Remember, he baptized people once they repented and turned from breaking the law or breaking the Torah of Yah. We again see this in Luke chapter 1, verses 13 through 17. The angel said unto him, fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John. And thou shalt have joy and gladness, and many shall rejoice at his birth. For he shall be great in the sight of Yahweh, and shall drink neither wine nor strong drink, and he shall be filled with the Holy Ghost, even from his mother's womb. And many of the children of Israel shall he turn to Yahweh, their Elohim. And he shall go before him in spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for Yahweh. And so now, if we're looking at the second coming, we're going to see the ministry, the message of Elijah. So how do we recognize the ministry and the message of Elijah? Again, remember you the law of Moses. Remember the Torah of my servant. We recognize it by its function. By its function, and the major element of the ministry of Elijah is he comes with the message of Malachi 4:4. Remember the Torah of Moses. And so there is a movement that's going on. You can say the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, wherever you want to put it, throughout the body of Messiah, where people's eyes are awakened and opened up. The fellowship we currently attend are people that are just recently, let's say in the last 5 to 7 years, have come out of Sunday keeping churches and are now turning towards keeping the Torah of Yah. And this is going on not only in America and Canada, but it's also going on in Europe and Asia and Africa and even the Middle East and people throughout the world. The people are discovering that they are embracing what many people label as their Hebraic roots, but embracing Torah. They're embracing the expression of faith, of following Torah as a response to believing that Yeshua is the Messiah that saved us by grace through faith. As a response to him saving us by grace through faith, then we follow Torah. As he said, if you love me, keep my commandments. In this realization, there is once again a connection that people are having to keep the biblical Sabbath, to keep the annual feast days, to realize that he taught us the proper way to eat. So I'd like to submit to you that you are part of a ministry and the message of Elijah. You are responding to that ministry and the message of Elijah. So like the song says, these are the days of Elijah. I really believe that we are in and are experiencing the days of Elijah. So this is a sign of the coming and the approach of the Great Tribulation, as well as the day of Yahuwah. So then I want to share with you what I believe is a major sign of the coming of the Great Tribulation, the great and terrible day of Yahuwah. As I mentioned, these two things which I gave you, the blood moon and the ministry of Elijah, and the third one, which I'm going to speak about, these are not the only signs of the coming of Yahuwah, of the day of Yahuwah. There are many others, but these are some of the most significant ones that we can more easily connect to and recognize. And so the third one that I want to list for you is a sign of the coming of the Great Tribulation and the day of Yahuwah, that the nations will divide the land of Israel, and it will divide the city of Jerusalem. And the application, the expression of the nations in doing this is that they seek to create on the mountains of Israel, otherwise known in Scripture as Judea and Samaria, what the world calls the West Bank, a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. This event is a sign of the coming of the Great Tribulation and the day of Yahuwah. So we can see this because in the book of Joel, it is written in the context of day of Yahuwah. Let's begin in Joel 1, verse 15. This is, alas for the day of Yahuwah is at hand, and as a destruction from the Almighty shall it come. Then in Joel 2, verses 1 and 2. Blow you the trumpet in Zion, and sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of Yahuwah cometh, for it is nigh at hand, a day of darkness, of gloominess, a day of clouds and of thick darkness. As the morning spread upon the mountains, a great people and a strong. There hath not been ever like, neither shall there ever be more after it, even to the years of many generations. So we see that the context of the book of Joel is the day of Yahuwah. And then it says Joel in chapter 3, verse 2, that the nations will divide the land of Israel. Joel 3, verses 1 and 2. For behold, in those days and in that time, when I shall bring again the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem, I will also gather all nations and shall bring them down into the valley of Jehoshaphat, and will plead with them there for my people and for my heritage Israel, whom they have scattered among the nations and parted my land. Let's look at a couple of other translations of Joel chapter through there. It says, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. Then I will enter into judgment with them on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel. This is the New American Standard Bible. And they have divided up my land. Young's literal translation says, and my land they have apportioned. So then if we go to Zechariah chapter 14, in verses 1 and 2, we read, it says, behold, the day of Yahuwah cometh, and thy spoils shall be divided in the midst of thee. For I shall gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. People in half of that city will be taken, and that half of the city will be taken. So the dividing of Jerusalem in Zechariah 14, verse 1 and 2 is said to take place as a sign of the coming of the day of Yahuwah. And then if we continue in verse 3, it says, then shall Yahweh go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. So that is when the nations divide the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem, it will bring about the judgment of the nations. And then while the nations are being judged, at the same time that the nations are being judged, it's at the same time that Elohim of Israel will end the exile of his people. And who is in the exile? The 12 tribes of Israel. Let's go to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37. We're going to read verses 15 through 28. I don't know if you'll see that very well. It's kind of smaller. Beginning in verse 15, it says, the word of Yahweh came unto me, saying, moreover, thou son of man, take thee one stick and write upon it for Judah and for the children of Israel, his companions. And take another stick and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and for all the house of Israel, his companions. And join them one to another into one stick, and they shall become one in thy hand. And when the children of thy people shall speak unto thee, saying, wilt thou not show us what thou meanest by these? Say unto them, thus says Yahuwah Elohim, behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel his fellows, and will put them with even him, even with the stick of Judah, and make them one stick, and they shall be one in my hand. And the stick whereupon thou writest shall be in thy hand before thy eyes. And say unto them, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I will take the children of Israel from among the heathen, whither they be gone, and shall gather them on every side, and bring them unto their own land. And it shall make them one nation in the land upon the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be their king to them. And it shall be no more two nations, neither shall be divided into two kingdoms any more at all. And continuing in verse 23, neither shall they defile themselves any more with their idols, nor with their detestable things, nor with any of their transgressions. But I will save them out of all their dwelling places when they have sinned, and will cleanse them so that they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim. And David my servant shall be king over them, and they shall have one shepherd. They shall also walk in my judgments and observe my statutes and do them. And they shall dwell in the land that I have given unto Jacob my servant, wherein your fathers have dwelt. And they shall dwell therein, even they and their children and their children's children forever. And my servant David shall be their prince forever. Moreover, I shall make a covenant of peace with them. There shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I shall place them and multiply them, and will set my sanctuary in the midst of them forevermore. My tabernacle also shall be with them. Yea, I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people. And the heathen shall know that I, Yahuwah, do sanctify Israel, when my sanctuary shall be in the midst of them forevermore. Just an aside, I don't know if you've ever done, you notice here he says, I'm going to give them or make a covenant of peace with them. If you ever do a scripture study on that and who has the covenant of peace, actually goes all the way back to one of the priests of Israel in the Old Testament. But it's mentioned a few other times too, kind of an interesting study. The prophecy of Ezekiel, wherein the northern kingdom known as Ephraim or Joseph is going to be united with the southern kingdom or the house of Judah. And so this is a period of time when we have the end of the exile of the 12 tribes. This prophecy in Ezekiel is one of the many prophecies regarding it. And so because of the traditional church teaching regarding who Israel is, when we talk about the end of the exile of the 12 tribes, most Christians are going to think of the Jews. And so that's a whole other element in aspects to itself to realize the Jews. And we're talking here about Joseph, though, and Ephraim. We're talking about the non-Jewish family of the Messiah. That he's going to take believers in Yeshua, the Messiah, that are non-Jewish, and he's going to unite them with the house of Judah. And that would mean that Jewish believers and non-Jews that are not believers are going to end up being the believers. The end of the exile, the reunification, takes place in the land of Israel. So the judgment of the nations, which is the primary element of the judgment of the nations, or the stronger element of the judgment, is called the Great Tribulation. So the end of the exile of the 12 tribes is going to take place during the Great Tribulation. And so ultimately, when the nations are judged and when the exiles are gathered back to the land of Israel, the culmination of these two things, Yeshua is going to set his feet on the Mount of Olives. And once he sets his feet on the Mount of Olives, sets up formally his kingdom on earth. And where it says in Isaiah 2, verses 2 and 3, says, "And it shall come to pass in the last days that the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted upon the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. And many people shall go and say, Come ye, and let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of Elohim of Jacob. And he shall teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, or the Torah, and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem."
Hey, John, this is
Yes.
Hal here. With the gathering of the remnant of Israel, do you see this kind of paralleling the sealing of the 144,000?
Not sure. I think it could be a bigger group. I think the 144,000 may be an element of this, maybe. I think it could be a bigger group, though.
Of
But
course,
I'm not sure.
right on the heels of it, it talks about from every nation, tribe, and tongue, and a group that you couldn't number easily, at least. And that would be also inclusive of the tribes. So
Right.
maybe those two are addressing what you're talking about.
Right.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Oh, and real quick, what translation are you using?
This is basically the King James, but I've inserted the names in place of the Lord and Jesus and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
We're familiar with paraphrases. I do a few of those.
You have the Hal scriptures?
The Hal paraphrase, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
These are JPs here.
So we read here in Isaiah that he's going to be teaching Torah to all the nations from Jerusalem. And so his millennial kingdom is when the Torah is taught to the whole earth. He's king in the earth and of the earth, and the nations are learning and following and practicing his Torah. And so then, in looking at this bigger picture, why is this event, or the dividing of the land of Israel and of the city of Jerusalem, why is this such a serious thing? That it's going to bring about this judgment of the nations and the great tribulation and the day of Yahuwah. Why is it going to bring about this time on earth that it has never been experienced and never seen? Again, it's because this battle that is being waged here, we can actually see it being played out in the natural regarding the land of Israel and regarding the city of Jerusalem is a spiritual battle over kingship and firstborn. Jerusalem represents the kingship, and Judea and Samaria, commonly called the West Bank, is going to represent the issue of the firstborn. And so this battle over kingship and the firstborn is the bigger picture. It's a battle between Yahweh and Yahshua and Satan. And the battle over the kingship is one that goes back to one of the things that we're told about before there was the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Wherein we're told that Lucifer rebelled against Yah, and he desired to have his throne. And so when he desired to have his throne, he wanted to be king. He wanted to be the ruler over everything. So that rebellion was challenging the throne or the kingship of Yah. And so that spiritual battle between them did not end when the rebellion attempt, it was continuing on the earth. And when Adam and Eve was created, this battle was going on where mankind is part of that spiritual battle that was going on between Yah and Lucifer. And then ultimately, if you really understand Yah's order, that in order to rule and reign in the universe, in the world, and in his kingdom, that you must have the position of king. You must be walking in the office of king and of priest and of firstborn. Now, when you have the office of king and priest and firstborn, alternatively, this office and these functions, you are then what Scripture refers to sometimes as Melchizedek, a Melchizedek priest. So you could say in one sense, and if you break down Melchizedek, it just means Melchi is king and Zedek is righteousness. So Adam was in a type of a Melchizedek priest. He was given authority over the creation. Elohim is the king, but he gave the stewardship of his creation to Adam. So Adam was the authority over the creation. So the title over that authority is that he's the Melchizedek type priest. And he was a ruler over the earth, and he was to direct worship towards Yah. So he functioned as a priest. And he was in the position of being the firstborn of Elohim. And so ultimately, the book of Genesis then explains to us what happened, beginning with Adam regarding this office, and ultimately the reason why we're given the various genealogies is it tells us who are the firstborns in line. Because once Adam died, the one who was the oldest firstborn after Adam, who was faithful to seek to follow the ways of Yah, to teach others, then they got that office. Now, in this message today, I'm touching on several topics. Many of them by themselves could be whole messages. So I'm kind of going to be skimming over some of this. So ultimately, if you go out and study this, actually, we're going to be told something interesting about this in the book of 2 Peter. In 2 Peter 2, verse 5, it says, "And he spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the whole world of the ungodly." Now you notice in the King James, and it's one of the reasons I like the King James, is because when they've added words, it's in italics. And that word person is in italics. So most people think that this is speaking of he's the eighth person that was saved from the flood. But that's not what it's saying. It says, "But you saved Noah, the eighth, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." So Noah was the eighth in this line of priests. But how is that so? Because Noah was the 10th generation from Adam. But he was only the eighth in this office. I'll just show you a chart really quick here. So we have the 10 generations that show from Adam down to Noah until the time of the flood. I'm trying to remember. One of the things that we know, though, is that Jared outlived Enoch, because Enoch was translated, as it says, and Methuselah outlived Lamech. So Methuselah actually handed things down to Noah. So that's how there can be 10 generations, but Noah being only the eighth in this line of priests. And ultimately from Noah, things transferred down to Shem, to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. Jacob then had the office and the title of king, priest, and firstborn in the earth. If you follow down the line, So in Genesis, we read about Jacob and Esau. And it's interesting, in Genesis 25, verses 29 through 34, it says, And Jacob sowed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint. And Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with the same red pottage, for I am faint. Therefore was his name called Edom. And Jacob said, Sell me this day your birthright. And Esau said, Behold, I am at the point to die. Remember that phrase. What shall this birthright do me? And Jacob said, Swear to me this day. And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he did eat and drink, and he rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. We're told how Esau sold his birthright. Now, why was this such a significant thing? Is because from Esau was in the line to be the ruler of the earth in Elohim's kingdom and carry on this office. But you could lose the office if you were unfaithful in your responsibilities and in your tasks. You could go to the next in line that was faithful. And so what we're told regarding Jacob and Esau, and now this becomes a detail, Jacob and Esau and the birthright becomes a detail to explain generally this office, but then it gets broken down specifically to this thing of the firstborn. And so what we're told about Jacob is that he dwelt in tents. And we're told that Esau is a man of the field. Now this is literal, but it's spiritual as well. It's literal because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they lived in tents. But dwelling in tents is a Hebraic expression that means that they studied Torah, that they studied Yah's ways, that they studied his laws. That actually Jacob learned Torah, if you map it out, from Shem and Eber and from Abraham and from Isaac. Those were his four primary sources that taught him Yah's ways. And he got passed down ultimately from Adam. So the scripture says Esau was a man of the field. And so Yeshua explained in the parable of the sowers that the field is the world. Man is fleshly. So in other words, when Esau sold his birthright, he didn't care about the spiritual things as it relates to following the ways of Yah. He wanted to do his own thing. He was more concerned with the affairs of the world and the love of the world. So we're giving you a detail regarding these two that as a result of Esau only caring about himself, actually what our scripture does not say, but a detail regarding that selling of the birthright is mentioned in the book of Jasher. Now, Jasher is mentioned a couple times in scripture, whether we have the actual book of Jasher or not, or Yasher. But in the book of Yasher, it says that Esau had killed Nimrod, and that those who supported Nimrod were upset that Esau did this, and they were coming after him. And Esau was afraid that they were going to come after him and kill him. And so Esau here is concerned about his life, and he says, now listen, here it is, pick it up in Genesis 25. He says, I'm about to die. So he says, no, look what rules and reigns in the world and Yahweh's kingdom and Yahweh's place. Yeah, I got the position, but I'm going to die. What good does it do me? And so he says, well, at least I can get a bowl of soup for it and live another day. And he sells his birthright. Now, I don't know whether you believe that or not, but it does give some context to maybe why he made that statement. So we're then told in the birth of Jacob and Esau that there would be a struggle between them. And that struggle, if you read the Hebrew, it says it would go on for every generation until the end. And Jacob's name, Yaakov, in Hebrew, if you take the root of his name, it's Akov, and it means the heel, but it also means the end. And that would be that when he touched hold of Esau's heel, it was a prophecy that only at the heel, only at the end, only in the end of days, only in the last generation, only at that time of the coming of the Messiah would Jacob finally get victory over Esau. Because there's going to be a spiritual war between them for each generation until the end of days. And so the battle between them actually is what is playing out in the nations wanting to divide the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem. And so from Jacob and Jacob's family, the Bible begins to give us details about Jacob and his sons and his family so we can understand what happened to these offices and what Elohim was doing through his covenant that he makes with Abraham and with Isaac and Jacob. Because when we look at the detail of what happens from Jacob and within Jacob's family, ultimately in Genesis, and how these three offices, the kingship, the priesthood, and the firstborn, are separated to Jacob's sons. Let's begin in Genesis chapter 49. Genesis 49, verses 8 through 10 says, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thy enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From thy prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down and he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. So we see here that Judah was giving the blessing of the kingship. Judah was given the blessing of the kingship, and as we know, King Yeshua comes through the tribe of Judah. Scripture tells us how things are supposed to go to the oldest in Jacob's family. The oldest was Reuben, and the next was Simeon. But ultimately, the blessing of the firstborn in Genesis 48 goes to who? We know it goes to Joseph and actually to his children. Genesis 48, verses 15 through 22. And he blessed Joseph and said, God, before thou whom thy fathers Abraham, Isaac did walk, the Elohim who fed thee all thy life unto this day, the angel which has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads and let my name be named on them. It's talking here about Ephraim and Manasseh. Let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he held up his father's hand and removed it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn. Put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he shall also be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. And shall be blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel be blessed, saying, Elohim make thee as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. And Israel said to Joseph, Behold, I die. The Elohim shall be with you, and shall bring you again into the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and with my bow. So this blessing of the firstborn goes to Ephraim and to Manasseh to a lesser extent, who are the sons of Joseph. And so a big question you have to ask is, how did somebody that's not in the line to be the firstborn, since it was associated with birth order, how does someone of Joseph and Joseph's sons get the firstborn and the birthright blessing? There's a detailed explanation about Joseph, who he is, what happened to him, etc. And that he had these sons. And it takes up a good deal of the book of Genesis to give you the detail, because it's very important detail to answer that question. How is this so? And so actually Joseph, through Ephraim and Manasseh, he gets the blessing of the firstborn. And then the firstborn still had the responsibility from creation, from Adam, to be the one that brings worship, to be the priest to Yahweh. For from the incident of the golden calf, the firstborn lost their role because they were involved in the worship of the golden calf. And ultimately it was given to Levi, and the Levites specifically, but Aaron's families, who Yahweh assigned to get the position of priesthood. So there were these three offices that Adam held to himself: the king, the priest, and the firstborn. That within Jacob, those functions are now being split. And when Judah gets the kingship, Joseph, the firstborn status, and the priesthood, by the incident of the golden calf, goes to Levi. So then we're given details about Jacob's family, from initially Joseph going to Egypt and Jacob's family going to Egypt, and how Pharaoh oppressed them, and how they get redeemed out of Egypt. So now what's probably not at the forefront of most people's mind that relates to this issue, which relates to the spiritual battle over the land and the dividing of the land and the significance of it, is that Passover is a celebration or the redemption of the firstborn. It's a celebration or redemption of the firstborn because the children of Israel didn't come out of Egypt until the 10th plague, which was the death of the firstborn. So we read in Exodus 4, verse 22 through 23, it says, "Thou shalt say unto Pharaoh, thus says Yahweh, Israel is my son, even my firstborn. And I shall say unto thee, let my son go, that he may serve me. And if thou refuse to let him go, behold, I will slay thy son, even thy firstborn." So in essence, the Pharaoh has enslaved Yahweh's firstborn. And Yahweh was going to redeem his firstborn. So in a sense, the judgment upon Egypt was all about the issue of the firstborn. And then also, who is the authority over the firstborn? Not Pharaoh, but the Elohim of Israel. So he asserts his position of kingship as king, you might say, over his firstborn. So that's a mini picture of the battle over kingship and firstborn that was taking place in Egypt, which is going to be a picture for you of what's going to be playing out at the end of days. And so then one of the details that might probably get missed is that the children of Israel being redeemed from Israel, that Yahweh taking them to the promised land in fulfillment of the covenant of the promises made to Abraham, is that at the end of, we see in Genesis chapter 50, at the end of the chapter of Genesis, we see in chapter 50, verses 24 through 26, "And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and Elohim will surely visit you and bring you out of his land unto the land which he swore unto Abraham and to Isaac and Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, Yahweh will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones from hence. And so Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt." Joseph says, "Take my bones, Joseph's bones, and take his bones, and when the Elohim of Israel fulfills his promise to Abraham, they are to take Joseph's bones with them and bury them in the land." Let's go on to Exodus 13, verse 19. "And as they were leaving, it says, Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, for he had straitly sworn the children of Israel, saying, Yahweh will surely visit you, and you shall carry my bones away hence with you." And so Moses takes his bones, and then you have to continue by looking into the book of Joshua to see the fulfillment of all of this. At the end of the book of Joshua, the way the book of Joshua ends is we're told what happens to Joseph's bones. It's in Joshua chapter 24, and we read in verse 32. It says, "And the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, buried they in Shechem, in a parcel of ground which Jacob bought of the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of silver, and it became the inheritance of the children of Joseph." So in one regard, the redemption from Egypt was all about bringing Joseph's bones back to the land. Okay, now since they're telling you historical information and details, there's a very major Torah principle that is connected to all of this in the importance and significance of these details. Because that which happens physically is to teach you a spiritual truth, to teach you a spiritual message. There's a major Torah principle that which happens to the forefathers happens to the descendants. Or as you might say, biblical history is prophecy. So when we're explaining to you that this is literal and it's detail, it's also prophecy. It's all to give you a deeper understanding and a deeper message. And it's to teach you about two things, the Messiah and the ways of the kingdom of Yah. He's giving you the natural to understand the spiritual. And so then if we follow on this, that in the story of what happens to the children of Israel who get redeemed out of Egypt, and they come to Mount Sinai, and the name of the people that are at Mount Sinai, they're called the house of Jacob. And we learned when they came out of Egypt that it was not just the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob who came out of Egypt. It wasn't just those physical descendants, but a mixed multitude that came out with them. So the house of Jacob consists of the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are faithful to the covenant and the covenant promises and to follow Torah of the Elohim of Israel, but as well as anyone who wanted to sojourn with them and to follow after the ways of Elohim of Israel. We call those grafted in, the adopted, the strangers, they're sojourners. So then ultimately, when the children of Israel come into the promised land, in the time we have King David that rules over all 12 tribes of Jerusalem. When King David rules over all 12 tribes of Jerusalem, that is a prophetic picture of the Messiah ruling over all 12 tribes of Jerusalem. And this is a messianic ideal, is the Messiah is going to rule over all 12 tribes, and they're proclaiming him king in Zion because David established Zion, or in the Hebrew, Zion. But then following the days of David and his son of Solomon, the kingdom was split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And the leading tribe of the southern kingdom was the tribe of Judah. And the leading tribe of the northern kingdom was the tribe of Ephraim. Now Ephraim was the one that was given the blessing of the firstborn. And Judah was the one that was given the blessing of the kingship. So in effect, the southern kingdom is a kingship nation, and the northern kingdom is a firstborn nation. So now we're told details about what happens to the northern kingdom through their king, Jeroboam, who was an Ephraimite, but he set up an alternative place of worship and didn't follow the Torah, as the Elohim of Israel prescribed the Torah to be followed. And ultimately, as a result, as we see from the book of Hosea, that the northern kingdom was cut off from the covenant. And it says Israel went into exile. But now we have a problem, because the one who is supposed to be the leader spiritually of the family, I know the Levites were the priests, but the firstborns, because they were told they were the firstborn, is to get a double inheritance. And if anyone from the family left the family or parted from the family or had problems, in other ways that they had parted from the ways of Yah, it was a responsibility of the firstborn to bring them back into the family and the ways of the family, which means to follow Torah of Yahweh. And this office was such that if it required you to lay down your life to redeem those in your family, you were to be responsible even to, if you had to, lay down your life to restore the family. And so now we have the one who has that responsibility that have a problem that they've departed from Torah. Now they're even cut off from the covenant. So we've got a serious problem. And so how are we going to bring them back into the right and proper relationship? Well, that's going to be the role and the task of the Messiah. Because Yeshua, in one regard, is going to, at his first coming, die at Passover. And if you remember, Passover is a celebration of what? Of the redemption of the firstborn. And so Yeshua wants to bring reconciliation to the family. He's ultimately redeeming the earthly firstborn Ephraim, who has departed from the family. And this Torah says the firstborn must be redeemed. So how is Yeshua the rightful one to fulfill the task to redeem the firstborn? Because positionally, we have the Father, Elohim, the Father who is the highest in authority in the kingdom. And then we have the Son who's under the authority of the Father. He's the one, the Father, he is under the Father, but he's under his authority, but he is given authority. And he's given the title, the Son has the title of firstborn. And he's got the title of firstborn of the family of his Father. And now he's the firstborn of the heavenly. So the Father sends his firstborn Son to redeem his firstborn in the earth, to reconcile his firstborn in the earth back to him. And so we know that's why he says in Scripture, Yeshua says, I've come to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now he's the firstborn of the heavenly, so he's being sent to redeem the firstborn of the earthly. And so what the Elohim of Israel does, he does legally, because ultimately the Messiah is to be the king over all 12 tribes, and he's to be proclaimed and regarded as the king of Israel. So now we have here the kingship nation who is in the land at the time the Messiah is born. And ultimately, when Yeshua rides into Jerusalem on the donkey, he's going to end up facing a trial regarding, who are you? And the part who was there to judge and to give judgment regarding who he is was the Jewish leadership. And that Jewish religious leadership represented the kingship part of the family. And so now the religious rulers who have the religious authority over the people, they're going to rule regarding the Messiah, and whether they're going to accept him as the king of Israel. But then he's also then king of Jerusalem. And so ultimately they reject him as their king. The kingship nation rejects Yeshua, the Messiah, as their king. Now we have to ask, what if they would have received him as king? If the kingship nation would have received him as their king, would have he set up his kingdom because he got acknowledged by the kingship office for being the king of Israel? But if the Jewish people would have recognized Messiah and proclaimed him king, then we have a problem. The firstborn is not back in the family. So Paul explains it was the plans and the purposes of Yahweh that the rejection of Judah initially enabled the Messiah to redeem the firstborn and to make a reconciliation to the world, to any who would join themselves to Israel. So these are all issues of the firstborn and of kingship. And it's what I'm trying to amplify to you. This is an important thing. And again, it goes clear back to Adam. This is the picture I've tried to describe and to show for you. And so now, from the death of his first coming, he redeems the firstborn. And so then ultimately, then what happens is the kingship nation that rejected Yeshua, and in their rejection, they basically made him available to whosoever wanted him. And so the ministry of Elijah is to call the people of Yahweh and all the people to make them aware that they are being influenced doctrinally by Esau and the characteristics of Esau. This is what Esau does in chapter 27 when Esau wasn't given the blessing, and he realized that Isaac had given the blessing to Jacob. Esau cries out and he says, "Isn't there a blessing for me?" We can read that in Genesis 27, verses 1 through 7. It says, "And Isaac trembled very exceedingly and said, Who is he that hath taken venison and brought it to me? And I have eaten of all thou as cometh, and have blessed him. Yea, and he shall be blessed. And when Esau heard the words of his father, he cried with a great and exceeding bitter cry, and said unto his father, Bless me, even me also, O father. And he said, Thy brother came with subtlety, and hath taken away thy blessing. And he said, is not my rightly my, I'm sorry. And he said, is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? And Isaac said unto him, Esau, behold, I have made him thy Lord. And all his brethren have I given to him for servants, and with corn and with wine I've sustained him. And what shall I do now unto you, my son? And Esau said unto his father, hast thou but one blessing, my father? Bless me even also, O my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and he wept. Now notice here, it's Esau, the one that calls Jacob the supplanter, that he took away 2 things. But we know that Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. Jacob didn't take it. The birthright, the firstborn, and Isaac alludes to the blessing being the kingship, because he says to Esau, thou, that I have him thy Lord or master. He has the authority. Esau cries and he says, isn't there a blessing for me? Please bless me, bless me. So Esau wants a blessing. What blessing? He wants the blessing of the firstborn. He wants the blessing of the firstborn, but he's a man of the field. He wants the blessing of the firstborn, but he does not want to follow Torah. He wants the blessing, but he doesn't want to follow the Torah. He doesn't want to study Torah. He doesn't want anything to do with the Torah. Now, I'm not going to dwell in tents. He doesn't want anything to do with the Torah. Well, this is the doctrine and the voice of Esau. I get all the blessing. I don't need to follow Torah. Well, that's a voice that we hear in a lot of Christianity. We get all the blessings. Yeshua did it all. Yes, he did it all. But remember, we have to repent, right? Repent from what? Breaking his Torah. And be baptized and enter into the covenant. But to say we get all the blessings, we don't have to do anything. It's all grace. We don't have to do anything. It's all love. We don't have to follow Torah, study the Torah, nothing. Well, that's the voice of Esau. He's dressing like Jacob. I represent the Messiah. He's dressing like Jacob, but his voice is, and his doctrine is, the voice of Esau. And so Yahweh wants us to come out of the Greco-Roman thinking and the influence of Esau and from the teaching of Esau, because in certain areas, Esau being a false witness against the Messiah and not properly representing him. So Esau and his doctrines are ultimately going to be judged. But in order to change the hearts of the people, so the people would repent, that's the purpose of the ministry and message of Elijah, to remember the Torah of Moses. And the message comes forth to show the people that they have departed before the coming of the Messiah. And I would like to submit to you that the movement that's going on, that in these days of Elijah, that the spiritual battle between Jacob and Esau is fought on all levels. This is the religious level that's being played out. So if you believe in Yeshua, if you're trying to figure out how to believe, if you believe in Yeshua, in the scriptures, you have to live your life in the right way. You have to been taught how you should do that. And whether you realize it or not all, but part how he's been presented and shown and talked to has been described as the doctrine of Esau. Many people are following that. And now Esau basically sees, and how Esau basically sees Paul. They say that Paul taught you that you shouldn't have to follow the Torah. But that's a blatant lie. And so it's being played out in the religious arena that way, but it's also being played out over the issue of the land. Because ultimately, when Joseph's bones are brought back to the land, where is he buried? It's not in Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob were buried. No, he's buried in Shechem. Joseph buried in Shechem. I don't know if you've ever been to Israel, but if you standing in the east and facing to the west, and if you're looking towards that way, you have Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And there's a valley between them, and Shechem sits in that valley between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. And Mount Ebal, it's the mountain of curse. And Mount Gerizim is the mountain of blessing. So it's sort of like Joseph's bones are sitting there, and the Elohim of Israel is saying, well, what do you think about Joseph's bones? If you think properly, you get the blessing. If not, you get the curse. I'm sure many of you have heard me mention the two-house controversy. Whether their two houses are taught. Well, it's all controversy over Joseph's bones and who Joseph is. And if you have to be in a valid decision about what you think about Joseph's bones, who really is Joseph? And so those who say that the two-house doctrine is a heresy, they say Joseph is Judah. That the people now in Israel, that's Israel. But Israel is the name given to Joseph and to Ephraim and Manasseh. How would you believe that Joseph is Judah? Judah is Judah. Joseph is Joseph. He's trying to tell you that Joseph's Judah. And so it's a battle over Joseph's bones. So now this gets played out. The spiritual battle and the spiritual struggle gets played out. Now you can see it physically in the land of Israel. There's much of the West Bank, not all of it, but much of Judea and Samaria is the inheritance of Joseph. It's the land given to Ephraim and Manasseh. Much of it is. So the battle is over Joseph's inheritance. And so now scripturally, what's happened is Esau is trying to get the nations to agree that the firstborn rights belong to him. That's what Esau is doing. How can I say that Esau is doing that? Because if we go to Psalms chapter 2, we'll see in Psalms chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. It says, why do the heathen rage, and why do people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel against Yahweh and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bands asunder and cast the cords from us. He that sits in the heavens shall laugh. Yahweh shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. Yet have I set my king upon the holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree Yahweh hath said. Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. And so now that verse is a quote, or is quoted in the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, chapter 4. Let's go there, Acts 4, verses 25 to 27. It says, who by the mouth of thy servant David has said, why did the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers were gathered together against Yahweh and against his Messiah. For of a truth, thy holy child Yeshua, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together. Herod and Pontius Pilate was involved in this. But why are they mentioned? Or why is that important? So who is Herod? He is an Edomite. He is Esau. And who is Pontius Pilate? He was a leader sent by Rome. And the Roman soldiers in Jerusalem at that time and later that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD were primarily from the 10th Legion. And if you do a little research, the 10th Legion was from the area of modern Syria, primarily Turkey, who was at that time the descendants of Ishmael and Esau. So Esau is also trying to establish himself as being the one who's the kingship. Satan, through Esau, through Herod and Pilate, is trying to take the kingship from Judah, and he's trying to take the firstborn from Joseph. That's what he's doing. Esau is trying to take the firstborn from Joseph and the position of kingship from Judah. The way he takes the kingship position from Judah is he wants to rule over Jerusalem. And the way he wants to take the firstborn from Joseph is he wants to peel a state in the mountains of Israel. Can you see the scheme? And so this is serious act of rebellion against Yahweh and against his covenant promise made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So that's why when this decree is made, Esau, really, when you understand it, Satan, is trying to get the nations to all agree. Now, in what form is Esau trying to get the nations to agree? It's called the forum is called the United Nations, since he's trying to get the nations of the earth, United Nations, in their governance structure to all agree that there should be a Palestinian state in the area given to Joseph. And that they're going to make a judgment over Jerusalem to divide Jerusalem and now not acknowledge Judah's right there, not acknowledge Yeshua's right there. So this is just not a casual thing. This is a spiritual battle that's really challenging the rule of Yeshua over Israel, who he rules from Jerusalem. And it's challenging the covenant promise that he made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which then goes to Joseph. And so now we see why this is so serious. So that actually, when this prophecy is saying, let's look at Ezekiel chapter 35, and the prophecy saying that Ezekiel chapter 35, it's a prophecy against Esau. And we're going to read Ezekiel 35, verses 1 through 15. We'll start with verses 1 and 2. It says, moreover, the word of Yahweh come unto me, saying, Son of man, sit thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it. It's a prophecy against Esau. How do we know that Mount Seir is Esau? Well, we go on in into 32, verse 3. I'm going to go to Genesis 32, verse 3, and we'll see this. It says, and Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, unto the land of Seir, their country of Edom. If you do a little research, you'll find that Seir, Mount Seir, Edom, and even Idumea, which is the Greek name for Edom, are all associated with Edom and Esau. So, again, we'll start again over in Ezekiel 35. Moreover, the word of Yahweh comes unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it. And say unto it, Thus says Yahweh Elohim, Behold, O Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out my hand against thee, and I will make thee desolate. And I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh, because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by force of the sword in their time and in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. Therefore, as I live, says Yahweh, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Sith thou shalt not hate blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make sure Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passes out of him that returneth. And I will fill his mountains with the slain men, and in thy hills and in thy valleys and all the rivers, and they shall fall that are slain of the sword. And picking up in verse 9, I will make thee a perpetual desolation, and thy cities shall not return. And you shall know that I am Yahweh, because thou hast said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine. Well, what two nations is he talking about here? Again, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And we shall possess it. Whereas Yahweh has said that Yahweh was there. Therefore, as I live, says Yahweh Elohim, I will even do according to thine anger and according to thine envy, which thou hast used out of the hatred against them. And I will make myself known among them when I have judged thee. And thou shalt know that I am Yahweh, and that I have heard all of the blasphemies which thou hast spoken against the mountains of Israel. Again, the mountains of Israel is the land of Joseph, of Ephraim and Manasseh, Judea and Samaria. They have boasted against me and have multiplied your words against me. I have heard them. Thus says Yahweh Elohim, when the earth when the whole earth rejoice, I will make thee desolate. As thou didst at the inheritance of the house of Israel, because it was desolate, so will I do to thee. Thou shalt be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all of Idumea, even all of it, but know that I am Yahweh. That's a prophecy about Esau. Esau is saying that the mountains of Israel belong to him. And then it says in Ezekiel 36, it goes on, Ezekiel 36, verses 1 through 8. Also, thou son of man, prophesy unto the mountains of Israel and say, ye mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh Elohim, because the enemy hath said against you, aha, even the ancient high places are ours in the possession. Therefore prophesy and say, thus says Yahweh Elohim, because they have made you desolate and swallowed you up on every side, that you might be a possession unto the residue of the heathen. And you are taken up in the lips of talkers and are infamy of the people. Therefore, ye mountains of Israel, hear the words of Yahweh Elohim. Thus says Yahweh Elohim to the mountains and to the hills and to the rivers and to the valleys, to the desolate wastes and to the cities that are forsaken, which become a prey and derision to the residue of the heathen that are round about. Therefore, thus says Yahweh Elohim, surely in the fire of my jealousy have I spoken against the residue of the heathen, and against all Idumea, again that's Esau, which have appointed my land into their possession, with the joy of all heart and with despiteful ways, and to cast it out for prey. Prophesy therefore concerning the land of Israel, and say to the mountains and to the hills and to the rivers and to the valleys, thus says Yahweh Elohim, behold, I have spoken in my jealousy, and in my fury, because you have borne the shame of the heathen. Therefore, thus says Yahweh Elohim, I have lifted up my hand. Sure, the heathen that are round about you, they shall bear their shame. But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches, and you shall yield fruit to my people of Israel, for they are at hand to come. That's an interesting set of scriptures there, because it basically talks the whole issue here that Esau is going to try to take possession, but Yah is going to stop it. And then he says to the mountains, shoot forth your branches, because his people Israel are at hand to come. They're at that time where they're going to return. So it's telling us that Esau is saying to the mountains, that they belong to us. Now, what is the mountains of Israel? The mountains of Israel, as I've said, is Judea and Samaria, commonly called the West Bank. And the mountains of Israel extends down and into Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is surrounded by mountains. And so they're saying that the mountains of Israel belong to him. He's saying that the West Bank belongs to him, that Jerusalem belongs to him. Has this ever happened before in history? Not in this sense. It's a prophecy yet for the future. And so now, over this act of rebellion, Yah is going to bring judgment against all those who are doing the rebellion. That's all the nations. And his judgment is the judgment of what we've referred to as the Great Tribulation. So the prince.
John, real quick question.
Yeah.
I've got the Tanakh here, and in some places it refers to the hills of Israel and the mountains of Israel. And as you know, sometimes hills and mountains are in reference to governments. It seems like that could be a potential explanation too, the governments of the different tribes of Israel. So just a quick thought to plug in.
I've thought of that. The piece that at the end of this Ezekiel 36, where it says, that, O mountains of Israel, you shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people, for they are at hand to come. Like they have not yet come, but they're about to come. And so, I understand. I agree that that's an interpretation. And certainly the mountains is a reference to nations and kingdoms and things like that as well. So it could be both physical and spiritual, I suppose. You could look at it that way.
There's also a comment in the chat room from Mark Thornton.
Go ahead, Mark.
No, he wrote it in the chat room.
Okay. Does somebody want to read that?
Are Palestinians descendants of Esau? I thought Turkey is Esau. And what about Romans 11:7? The elect are separate from Israel.
Okay, so there's two pieces, or at least two pieces there. So how can somebody remember this, and I can come back and address that at the end? That might be easier.
Well, he wrote it in the chat room, so I mean it'll be there. You can just go back to it.
Okay.
In the chat room, if you want to open it up, it is on the bottom of your screen there.
Yeah, I've got it closed off right now because I'm trying to see the screen better. So I'll come back to it, but remind me and I will come back to that.
All right.
So the next piece I wanted to touch on is Isaiah chapter 34. Isaiah 34 verses 1 through 8. So it's come near, ye nations, to hear and hearken, you people. Let the earth hear and all that is therein, the world and all things that come forth. For the indignation of Yahweh is upon all nations, and his fury upon all their armies. He hath utterly destroyed them. He hath delivered them to the slaughter. Their slain also shall be cast out, and their stink shall come up from out of their carcasses, and the mountains shall be melted with their blood. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all the host shall fall down, as a leaf that falls from the vine, and as the falling fig from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, and upon the people of the curse to judgment. The sword of Yahweh is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, and with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For Yahweh hath a sacrifice in Basra, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. And the unicorns shall come down with them, and the bullocks with the bulls, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fatness of fat of fatness. For it is the day of Yahweh's vengeance, and the year of recompense for the controversy of Zion. Several very interesting pieces in this one phrase, in this one set of scripture. It's interesting if you ever do a study on the Basra and where Basra is located. It's a very interesting piece. But we got this term here at the end. It's called the controversy of Zion. What is the controversy of Zion? See, this is all a spiritual battle over Zion. It's all about that. And so the word controversy there in the Hebrew is the word riv, which is a heated dispute. So I'm going to explain to you in greater detail how the Elohim of Israel is going to come against the nations for dividing his land and dividing the city of Jerusalem. It is the United Nations General Assembly that recommended the two-state solution clear back in 1947 and 48. They recommended a two-state solution and shared Jerusalem. So why is the policy of the United States and Europe that they want a two-state solution and a shared city of Jerusalem? Because they want things to line up with the United Nations and the votes and the desires of the United Nations. They want the world to be structured and lined up with the United Nations. And what's voted on and agreed upon in the United Nations called international law. And so then what happens is on November 29th, 2012, Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas brings again before the General Assembly a petition that the nations would recognize a Palestinian state based upon East Jerusalem as its capital and based upon the pre-1967 borders. And so when the vote was taken, over 130 nations of the world voted yes. So things are beginning to position that the Almighty can judge the nations. And then ultimately they're going to there were only 9 nations in the world when that vote happened that stood up and voted no. Among the 9 nations that voted no to not recognize the Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, one of the 9 nations was the United States. Now, the reason why the United States voted no was not because it was the policy against the Palestinian state or with East Jerusalem as its capital. They wanted to see it come about by direct negotiations. And actually, the United States calls direct negotiations is, I'm going to pressure you and twist your arm until you cry and scream until you agree to do what we want you to do and sign a piece of paper. Now, that's changed a little bit during the Trump administration, but still, as I mentioned, even his plan still was going to divide the land. It was just different areas were going to be taken. So, as of now, all the nations have voted, but that vote does not have the status of legality as it relates to recognizing a Palestinian state. And the reason is because in the United Nations, only the UN Security Council has the power to recognize a state. And the way the UN Security Council is structured, there's 15 members on the Security Council, 10 are rotating and 5 are permanent. And the 5 permanent ones have veto rights over anything that comes before the UN Security Council. So who are the 5 nations that have the veto rights? The United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. And up to now, the United States has vetoed this. So now historically, because the United States has wanted the solution to be based upon negotiation, they have been firm on that stance since 1967, when the Arab world wanted there to be a UN Security Council to recognize a Palestinian state. No, we're going to veto it, they say. We're not going to honor that. It's not going to happen that way. Now, the world says the reason why the peace process has failed is because Israel's fault, even though the Palestinians have not compromised on anything. They have wanted all the Jews out. They have said, well, you know, because they presented you a proposal back in 2008, you could have had Israel presented to them and they could have the Palestinian state of 96% of the West Bank. They said, no, we don't want 96% of the West Bank. We don't even want 98% of the West Bank. It's 100% of the West Bank. And we want all Jews out of East Jerusalem because you're building there. That's what's going to don't have peace. You know, that's because you want it to be there. And so no Jewish state, you need to give the Palestinians right in the state of Israel. So Jews can't have the Palestinians, don't want the Palestinian state, and they don't want them to be in Israel either because they don't have any rights. So this continues to just go on. Israel goes on trial in the media. They're falsely accused. They're falsely accused of the nations. They're going to say this is intolerable. So now the Arabs are rioting in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. That's happened many times in the past. So what has happened in the U.S. General Assembly or in the United Nations General Assembly has voted, but it's been signed by the UN Security Council. It's only that when it's signed by the UN Security Council that it's legal. So the Elohim of Israel cannot judge the nations until the UN Security Council recognizes the Palestinian state. And the only thing holding that up at this point is the United States. It's a legal position of the nations. Now, since the nations have taken the legal position, now the Elohim of Israel can bring a lawsuit against their legal position because he has a legal position. His legal position is the covenant made with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. In the way in which he made the covenant, he did it all legally. So it's his legal position against the United Nations legal position. They set up a system that didn't recognize the Torah and the kingship of Yah. And so this is how and why it'll bring about judgment upon the nations. I wonder if you've ever noticed that there are 3 areas in Israel where there is the most trouble between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Of course, Jerusalem and the Temple Mount is one. In the city of Hebron, This is another very tinderbox place where there's a small group of Jews surrounded by many Arabs. And this is the burial place where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are. And in the West Bank, especially in the area near Shechem, where Jacob's well and Joseph's tomb is located, where his bones are. Now, if you recall, all three of these were legal transactions for money to purchase the land. If you remember, I believe all three cases, land was offered to be given to Abraham and to David and to Jacob, not for money, but just to give to them. But they refused and paid money. And they became a legal transaction. And now that nations, especially Esau, are trying to undo that. So there's much more I could tie into this. There are many parts. How this ties into the Day of Atonement and Sukkot. How Yahweh starts his judgment. There's a mighty shaking of the earth. How he shall bring his people through by his way of the second Exodus. We read about that in Jeremiah 16. Will he lead his people like he did Israel coming out of Egypt with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night? How he will have a great pouring out of his spirit to his people prior to or at the beginning of this period. There's so much more, but for the time, I'm going to stop at this point. In the traditional explanation, when Yeshua sets his feet down on the Mount of Olives, there starts 1,000 years. There's no destruction. The destruction is over. But the day of Yahweh is destruction, at least at the beginning. Yes, it's destruction that will come from the Almighty. And that first part is the Great Tribulation. So in conclusion, I want to emphasize us to be more cognizant of watching events rather than dates. Many are giving dates and calculations, but we know that there are some of the events that must take place before Messiah's return. And these are some of the events that I've covered that we need to watch for. And we can't go much further down until the next event happens, and that is the dividing of the land of Israel. When the dominoes are going to start to fall, it's a sequence of events. So continue to watch for the sequence of events and know that this will be a pattern of the events. And as you see one, know that the next one is coming, and just watch to see how near and how close these events are happening. So that's it. That's the message I have, laying it out for you about the significance of the dividing of the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem, and why it's so serious, because it's associated with the battle over kingship and the firstborn. So let's give praise to Yah, all his glory and honor. Hallelujah. Amen.
Okay. Any comments, thoughts, ideas? I can restate Mark Thornton's question.
Or is it?
John, this is Jim Rutt. Where does the current peace process that's going on in the Middle East affect of the land? Because I never thought about it in those terms, but it would seem that this peace process would make that dividing easier.
Absolutely. And that's why I mentioned, with Trump, everybody thought, well, a lot of this stuff that Obama did was kind of on hold, but all he's doing is kind of shifting the deck chairs around on the Titanic. I mean, they want to give Israel the land where some of their outpost cities and stuff are, but and trade that for other land. So ultimately, they're still planning to have a dividing of the land. And so, yeah, I think as more of these nations come on, I don't know if people have watched this in the news about how many nations have now just recently signed these peace accords.
5 or 6?
Yeah. And a couple of the first ones was United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And very early on, after those accords were signed, there was a delegation from those two countries that came to Jerusalem to go up onto the Temple Mount. And when they did, the Palestinians came out and were all angry with them and were spitting on them and giving them a hard time because they had signed these
Could you
treaties.
tell me more about that? I hadn't read that.
Yeah, they because they were upset because these countries had signed the treaties. And after that, these countries went to Jordan. We have to remember that Jordan, through the WAF, has kind of control over that, but they give day-to-day control to the Palestinians. But these two countries came back and said to Jordan, you need to reassert authority and keep the Palestinians from having so much control and dictate that. So there's been a lot of stuff going on kind of behind the scenes about even to the idea of these countries. Saudi Arabia has even said they're ready. I mean, Trump alluded to there's several more countries ready to sign, but many of them are waiting to see what was going to happen with the presidential election because they wanted to see how they were going to get their best deal on armament and aircraft.
Saudi Arabia is not the best example. They've actually been friendly, even though not officially. They've been working with Israel for 15 to 20 years.
Absolutely. And especially with what's going on in Iran, Israel and Saudi Arabia has been working very closely together on that situation as well. So anyways, these nations are lining up to sign these treaties, and it's really been undercutting the Palestinians in terms of them being able to stand up to the pressure anymore. But again, ultimately, even under the Trump plan, there was still going to be a dividing of the land. So yeah, it's okay. Back to Thornton's. Are the Palestinians descendants of Esau? Well, depends on how you think about that. Maybe. There's a lot of the Palestinians there's a good portion of them who are actually Christian. But a lot of them are getting pushed out of cities like Bethlehem and things like that. Bethlehem used to be 60% Christian. It's down to something like maybe 25% Christian now because they've been so harassed by the Arabs and things. Turkey being Esau. Yeah, you have to remember that Edom back in biblical time was actually, you had Ammon and Moab, and then Esau was just south of that. Now, they've spread all over the place, and I think there's descendants of Esau and descendants of Ishmael in Turkey, in the area of Syria, those areas as well. But originally they were located south of Moab and Ammon. Romans 11, verse 7, the elect are separate from Israel. Let's take a look at that. Anybody else want to jump in on any of this? Go right ahead.
Oh, I have my own different can of worms I'm going to open. So
Okay, well then hold on to that can of worms till we can get through this can of worms first. Romans. Trying to get there. Hold on. So Romans 11, verse 7 says, what then? Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. So I think we have to read the context of all of chapter 11, because we see throughout chapter 11, it says Israel was blinded, right? all of Israel was blinded. But why is that? So a lot of people look at that as, well, it was the Jews that were blinded. But no, it says really all Israel was blinded so that those of the nations could come in. Now, when you think about the nations, well, it says the Gentiles, when we read that, you really should just say nations and who was in the nations. Oh, it was the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But, you know, you also have the verses here in Romans where it says not all Israel is Israel. So when you say Israel, just because they are of a physical descent doesn't mean they're Israel that Yah is working with. Because we see in Romans 11 where it talks about that these others are grafted into the olive tree, right? That they are grafted into Israel. Now, Paul didn't come up with that idea by himself, because that's actually listed in the Old Testament about Israel being an olive tree. And so yes, Israel in part was blinded so that, you know, he could go out and go to the nations. But again, who was in the nations? Yes, Gentiles in the sense, those of the nations, but that's where Israel was also scattered. So, you know, if you read through Romans, it talks about Paul saying that he would wish he could give himself up for his brethren. And that, you know, he's always called the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, we use that word Gentile in the thought that, well, we're talking about, you know, the heathen. But we have to remember that the word Gentile there just says the nations. Is a translation that you would see in a lot of places. And again, who was in the nations? It was the northern tribes that were scattered out into the nations. Not that
And wouldn't it be the
non-Israelite-
other 69 then? Isn't that really what it means? That it had been one and now it's all 70?
I'm sorry, say that again.
When it says it goes to the nations, it had been one, only one out of the 70. And when it says it goes to the nations, wouldn't it mean that it now goes to all 70?
Yes and no. Sorry.
Love to know the no, because my assumption has always been that it's been all 70 at that point. So what's
So ultimately, you know, why was Yah using Israel? Even back at the time of Mount Sinai. But they were supposed to be a kingdom of priests, just like we're supposed to be a kingdom of priests. And so that they would show an example to the nations to bring them back to Yah. You know, if you go back to the time of Nimrod and the Tower of Babel and all that, you know, all the nations had basically gone away from him. So he chose Israel to be a light to bring them back. And so we are supposed to be Israel. We are supposed to be priests. What priesthood are we supposed to be of? We're not of the Levitical priesthood, because we are priests under Yeshua, who is a Melchizedek priest. And so our job is to try to bring people back to Yah. And if it says, as Paul says in Romans chapter 11, you know, that is Israel, is the true believers. And so ultimately, we're really bringing all the nations back into being part of Israel, because you might say, in one sense, at the end of the day, when we get to the end of the book of Revelations and we have the city of New Jerusalem, there's 12 gates. And who are the 12 gates? Are each of the tribes of Israel. There isn't a gate of the Gentiles. So they have to come into the tree, the olive tree. So in the sense, yes, it's to reach out to all those other nations, but it's ultimately to bring them all in to those as being true believers of Yah.
John? Hey, it's Mark.
Yeah. Hey, Mark.
Yes, I'm the one that made the comments. I haven't seen you since 2012 out in Lansing. I met you in 2009 in Utica.
Oh, yeah. I remember.
But now I just want to clarify a couple of things here, because it's my understanding from Jeremiah 3, verse 8, that God divorced Israel. And from Matthew 22, in the parable of the wedding feast, Israel was replaced with another group of people. And in Romans 11:7, like I said, Israel has not obtained what it seeks, but the elect have obtained it, and the rest were hardened. So I thought that Israel was a separate group. The nation of Israel was a separate group from the elect. Now, there's a lot of people that think that when Yeshua returns that he's going to marry the nation of Israel. Well, that's not what I believe. It's only a remnant of the nation of Israel that will be among the elect.
Well, and I think that's why Paul says, not everyone who says they're Israel is Israel. Just because it's kind of like the whole thing that when Yeshua was talking to the Pharisees and all them, they say, hey, we're children of Abraham. He says, well, these stones could be children of Abraham. Just because you're descended physically, and really the book of Romans covers all that, just because you're physically descended doesn't necessarily mean you're part of Israel. It's those who are believers and follow Yah and follow his Torah and follow after him. Now, as for your point in Jeremiah 3, it talks about that Israel, the northern kingdom, he divorced. But he technically never divorced the southern kingdom.
Well, Jeremiah was part of the southern kingdom, and he saw the fall of Jerusalem.
Yep.
And then in Deuteronomy 24, verse 4, it says that it's illegal for a man to remarry a woman that he's divorced.
Exactly. But that's why Paul talks about in Romans chapter 7, where he talks about a woman who had been married and she left and married another, but then her husband died. She's no longer in sin because she's no longer away from him. But that would work both ways, right? So if the groom died, then there's no longer a marriage, right? So when Messiah comes and he dies for everyone's sins, basically, if you think of him, if you think he is the groom that was married with Israel back at the mountain, so he's dead now, there is no more marriage. But then now that he resurrects, they all come back into him and can be married again. But it's a new marriage now because he died once, and now we have a different marriage covenant under the new covenant. That's kind of a brief picture of that, but I don't know if anybody else has got any thoughts. I'm doing a lot of talking. Please.
Well, I do recall,
I would like to make an alternative option, if you don't mind, if that's okay, John.
Anybody jump in.
John, I do recall back at the Feast 2009 in Utica, you were doing a slideshow of Israel. And there was a black guy there that said, well, I don't see why anyone should have chosen status just because of their race. And I talked to him a day later and I said, well, nobody has chosen status because of their race, because it's about belief, not genetics. And haven't heard from him in a while, but I'm telling you that's really what it is. Remember when the Exodus happened out of Egypt, there was a mixed multitude of Gentiles that accompanied the Israelites, is because they adopted the beliefs of Israel.
Right.
And it's been that way since then. The door's always been open to anyone who wants to walk through it, if they will do it.
Yeah, and that's the scripture I read there in Ezekiel about the two sticks. It says, Judah and his companions, and Israel and their, or Ephraim and his companions. Well, who are the companions? It's those who have joined themselves to him and brought them together, and he's going to make them all. It's always been that way.
I'd like to make and this is Dennis, by the way.
Hey, Dennis.
I'd like to make a couple potential solutions here. I've always looked at the marriage as a metaphor. All right, Jeremiah 31. All right, of course, Jeremiah 31 is the most famous passage, is where he says, Days are coming when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's way down in verse 31 of chapter 31 in Jeremiah. Right. But way back up in verse 9, right, talking about all these kinds of things, he says, speaking of Ephraim, bringing them back, they will come with weeping, and by pleading I will bring them. I will lead them by streams of waters on a straight path in which they will not stumble. For I'm a father to Israel, and Ephraim is my firstborn. Right?
Right.
He uses both kinds of metaphors to describe this relationship with Israel, with Ephraim, with Judah. Right? So on one hand, it's a marriage covenant, but on the other hand, your father and son. Right? See, to me that looks like it's a metaphor for us to understand the kind of relationship we have. It's not a physical marriage, as it were. Right? It's in the same way, and we are co-heirs with Yeshua. Therefore, if we're co-heirs because we're brothers, we're adopted into the family. You don't marry your brother, right? So we have to understand. I believe that in a concept of a marriage. That's the first point I wanted to make, and the second point I wanted to make, and I think maybe we sometimes we get overly technical with some of this stuff. And I liked how you brought it back to the Tower of Babel earlier, right? At the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations, you have Nimrod and the Babylonians, and that's the bad guys of the story, right? Being set up. And the good guy is being established in Genesis chapter 12, the very next chapter, Abraham. He calls Abraham out of the Chaldeans, out of Babylon. Right? So now you've got two sides. You've got Nimrod on one side, you've got Abraham on the other. Nimrod represents the Babylonians and the world system, eventually Esau, and all that kind of stuff as you're talking about today. And Abraham is, of course, his grandson will be renamed Israel, and it's through them. And as you brought out, I loved how you brought out how the two sticks coming together and the companions, that we're going to be tied into Israel in that sense. But if we pay attention to Ezekiel and other places in the Old Testament, it tells you that not everybody who calls themselves Israel is going to be Israel. You're going to have those who are cut off and separated, because even Israel is going to be separated from the sheep and the goats. And those who are no longer part are going to be out. We see that all through the Torah, that you're going to be cut off. You're going to be out. You're no longer going to be Israel. There's going to be that's something that's going to happen as part of this judgment. So when we say spiritual Israel or it's not physical Israel, well, in a sense, it is physical Israel, and also those adopted into it, right? So it's not a racial thing. It's the fact that God made a promise to Abraham, right?
Right.
And his seed, which is not just singular in the case of Yeshua individually, but also corporately as well. And all those who are adopted in, that goes back to your point about the stone. So I think both those things really need to be kind of brought into bear as we try to understand these things.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Dennis. And the whole thing where it talks about in the book of Romans there kind of goes along with that is, it isn't because you're descendants or you have physical bloodline or anything else, but it says he called them because of the promises to Abraham, and he gave them certain promises. And I really like that. And I think I did a presentation at the feast one year about this, and that's in Romans chapter 9. And right in the first few verses of Romans 9, he says, Paul says, I say the truth in Messiah, I lie not. My conscience also heareth me, witnesses in the Holy Spirit, that I have a great heaviness and a continual sorrow in my heart. For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Messiah for my brethren, my kinsmen, according to the flesh. So he's saying, if I could basically, it's almost like Moses. In fact, this is really should in your mind, if you're following Torah, should bring you back to Moses, because Moses basically said, when Israel rebelled, he said, take me, but let them continue for your arm, for your glory, for your honor. Then he says, who are Israelites, and to whom pertaineth the adoption and the glory and the covenants and the giving of the law and the service of Elohim and the promises, which are the fathers, and of who are the concerning of the flesh, Messiah came, who is in all and over all. So if you go through that, there's actually 7 things that Paul lists there, and that those things belong to Israel. Okay. And it isn't because Israel is any great thing, but it's because it's a fulfillment of what he promised to Abraham. So yeah, they're children of Abraham, they're of the bloodline, but that don't mean anything. Because as if you go through all the examples in the Old Testament, just like we read about how Jacob was taken, he wasn't the firstborn, and even under Jacob, Joseph was taken, not Reuben. And even Isaac and Ishmael was the firstborn, but he wasn't taken. And, you can go all down through this. Abraham was not, I don't think, was the firstborn either. So, so he uses them. And so in the sense that, yes, blood doesn't mean anything except for the fact that Yah made it so because of the promise he made to Abraham. I don't know if that made sense or not, but anybody else? Somebody else wanted to jump in there.
Well, when you were talking about the various different factions in Israel right now, the UN resolution and that, it brought to mind a study that Mike Waters and I were, well, mainly Mike was doing. And he was always looking for signs, things to look for that signal the end, or the hot spots to look at to signal potential beginning of an end time event. And he was studying, and I believe it was Isaiah 17. And he was saying that, it was Isaiah 17, 1-6, I believe, talking about the destruction of Damascus. Damascus will be laid waste.
Right.
It'll be nothing there. And it will be Israel's glory that's destroyed. In other words, they're happy. We wiped it out. And then the very next thought is, but these will be the beginning of your lean times. These will be the beginning of your sorrows. And, you're mentioning the Esau and Syria and that, and I'm kind of wondering, is this actually part of, Israel is going to go, the events of the UN and all that will trigger the destruction of Damascus. And then, this is something we were looking at, and I didn't know if you wanted to read Isaiah 17 and just kind of go through it in the context that you just mentioned.
Isaiah 17. Well, you brought it up, so you read.
All right. The burden of Damascus. Behold, Damascus is taken away as being a city, and shall be a ruinous heap. The city of Aroah are forsaken, and they shall be for flocks, which shall lie down, and none shall be made afraid. And some translations say it shall be an inhabitants of dogs, or there won't be anything there except the flocks. The fortress shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria, and they shall be as the glory of the children of Israel, saith the Lord of hosts. And in that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob will be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. And it goes on from there, just basically saying it's not going to be a good time. And the end result is they shall finally look to their God. And I just, wondering if that fits into what you're saying, or maybe another way of, I don't know. It just popped into my head when you were mentioning the various different factions in there.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that the city of Damascus being a ruinous heap is probably certainly a sign towards the end time. When exactly that fits into the whole picture, I'm not sure. That maybe going along with that is the whole chapter of Psalms 83, where it talks about the enemies that make counsel against your people. And it names off several people, several nations, including Edom, the Ishmaelites, Moab, the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon, and the Amalekites, and the Philistines. And again, in both of those situations, that has never really happened in history. Certainly, Damascus has never been made a ruinous heap where nobody could dwell at it anymore. So it has to be a future event that's got to happen.
Well, if we're going to talk about Isaiah 17, then we also should pay attention to the context of when that was given, and that's dealing with the fall of the Northern Kingdom, right? At the same time, the Northern Kingdom falls, right? It's right after the Emmanuel prophecies in Isaiah 7-12. Okay, and in fact, right before this, it talks about when Ahaz is getting ready to die, you're getting these judgments of all the nations around it. When I read Isaiah 17, it makes me think of Amos. You know, at the beginning of Amos, it says, for Damascus, for the crimes of Damascus, the 3 crimes, no 4, and then for Edom and for Moab and for all these different peoples. And it's talking about these things. It's pointing about the destruction that's getting ready to come. And so it's destruction that's going to happen right then, but it's also a picture of the end times as well. It's both, right? Because that first, just like the Emmanuel prophecy is about Hezekiah in its initial fulfillment, but its ultimate fulfillment is going to be in Yeshua, right? And so in this case, you're talking about Damascus getting ready to be destroyed by Assyria, and then it compares that to what happens to Ephraim. Like in verse 3 here in Isaiah 17, the fortified city will disappear from Ephraim, right? Well, Ephraim, once Ephraim was destroyed by Assyria, it's no longer Ephraim. It's not my people. That's Hosea, right? Okay, so this is something that's already happened in that sense, but it's also something that's going to happen in the future, right? So when Isaiah is talking about this, he's talking about that. He's comparing it back to what's going to happen. And it brings us back to the Emmanuel prophecy, describing how Assyria, which is also Babylon, right? Because Nimrod is both Assyria and Babylon. It comes through the land and like a flood, okay, wiping away and making everything desolate all the way up to your very neck. And then eventually, and that's when, of course, the Messiah comes and saves the people. And that's when everyone looks around and go, oh, yes, God is with us, because what he just said came true. And of course, like I said, originally that initial fulfillment of that is Hezekiah, but it's only a partial fulfillment in the same way that the abomination of desolation was a partial fulfillment in the Maccabee period. And in 70 AD, the full fulfillment will be at the end times. So when we think about that, and we look back at that period of time, we can see the parallels and help us understand what we can expect going forward. We can expect the same kind of a flood to come through the land, to come take care of all these things, and to bring this kind of desolation that we're seeing here, right? Especially when you pay attention to the places of where they're at. In the Valley of Rephaim in verse 5, that's right outside Jerusalem, right? And when you see in verse 7 talking about, look to the Holy One of Israel, that should make us immediately be thinking about Daniel, right? And the Ancient of Days right there, and that imagery we have right there. And he's talking about judgment against his people for the things they're doing. And I mean, when you think about the judgment against Israel, the Northern Kingdom, you're thinking about their false worship of Yahweh. You're talking about the sins of Jeroboam, their false holidays and the golden calves and all that kind of stuff that they put up, in worshiping God. So anyway, that imagery needs to remember. We need to remember that. We can't forget the history that already has happened, because it works kind of like a cycle. It's a shadow of fulfillment then, and that tells us so much more about what's coming up in front of us.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what I've tried to mention throughout, is that the stuff that's history is a prophecy of what's going to happen in the future. So we lost, it looks like, most of the Blizzard household there.
Yeah, that's
I see you're still there. Hal and Scarlett left, I'm assuming.
everybody left. Yeah, we discussed things, and
Everyone's hitting the hay. I was listening in the other room because I have to have my feet up, but for their sake, I'm probably going to shut it down because it's kind of loud throughout the house. But
Sorry.
no, it's okay.
it's you need to get your rest.
Yeah, I'm probably going to turn on my phone then and listen in the other room.
Oh,
So.
well, tell Hal I really need to talk to him at some point. So maybe when he has an opportunity, have him call me.
Definitely, will do. So I'll turn on my other.
Good to see you.
Yeah, definitely. Same here.
John,
Okay.
There he is.
just wanted to ask you, how's your brother Jim doing?
Yeah, doing okay, I guess. He's trying to keep warm. I think they got hit some pretty bad snow there in Nebraska,
Yeah.
but ice and things. But yeah, he's been doing okay.
All right. Well, I haven't heard from him in quite a while.
Yeah. We so it's, of course, this last feast was kind of we kind of stayed a little closer to home and met with our group and a small group, here. But yeah, he didn't come the last time before that. So he's been doing fine. He's just fixed income, try to help him out when he can try to get there so he can get to the feast. But
Yeah, I've heard you speaking about 6 years because I remember asking you about Kenny Kitsky, and he's been dead for 5.5 years.
was that
Over 5.5.
yeah,
Wow, probably.
it was in 2015 he died.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the spring of 15. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's been weird. He attended the group that we used to attend with here, and we live in the kind of in the northern panhandle of West Virginia, but we're only about maybe 15 miles to get into Pennsylvania, and we met at a place up in Pennsylvania. It was kind of in the middle where they would come down and we'd meet together. So, but
Also, I got another question. Now, a lot of people think that the birth date of Israel is May 15th, 1948. I personally think it's December 9th, 1917, and that would be in Haggai 2, verse 18. I don't have my glasses now, but consider now from this day forward that the 24th day of the 9th month from the day of that is the foundation of the Lord's temple was laid, consider it, and from this day forward I will bless you. That would have been, well, okay, that was the 24th day of the 9th month would have been December 9th, and that would happen in 1917 when General Allenby and the British Army they drove the Turks out of Jerusalem, which was 2,520 years from the fall of Jerusalem, as I understand it. But that was when this was fulfilled, December 9th, 1917.
what is it's Haggai? What's the
Haggai 2, verses 18 and 19.
Yeah. I was trying to wonder. I was losing the. I don't think so.
So Mark, where are you at right now?
I'm in Wauwatosa, but I'll be in Cudahy by early next week.
Mhm.
I'm trying to think of that. The story of ugh, the what you just mentioned.
Hanukkah?
Yeah, the Hanukkah, but with the what's the people? What were they called?
Maccabees.
The Maccabees. I'm trying to remember if that. I'm trying to remember when that comes. If that's the 9th, is that in the 9th month also?
I don't know.
Because that would line up with like Antiochus Epiphanes and all that stuff as well. I'm just wondering if I'd have to check that out.
Well, December 9th is the 24th day of the 9th month.
Yeah.
And that's when Jerusalem was liberated from the Turks.
Okay.
And like I said, I thought the Turks were Esau.
I think
That's what he said in Worldwide.
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, I'm kind of, I think they've spread around from when they used to be, where they used to be back in at the time of ancient Israel, so I'm not really sure exactly where they're located.
Well, keep in mind that Amalek is also a tribe of Esau, and Amalek was spread all over the world. Haman was Amalek, all right, from the book of Esther, right, and he's all the way in Elam and Persia, right. So we wouldn't be surprised to see Esau spread all over the place, even up in Turkey.
Yeah.
Here's another question, though. Maybe this modern nation of Israel isn't the nation that will be at the end time. Because this not like they're walking around in there and when we read Ezekiel, we talk about the people coming back into the land. They're supposed to be coming back into the land, while seeking God's face. That's not the case with these people. They're not there seeking God's face.
Well,
right? This is not like the Babylonians returning from the Babylonian exile. This is not like that at all. This is more like the opposite of that.
Is this Dennis talking?
Yes, this is Dennis. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, and so when you asked earlier, Mark, about are the Palestinians descendants of Esau, let me throw a monkey wrench in a lot of things. Do you remember who the first prime minister of Israel was? His name was Ben-Gurion. And Ben-Gurion, before he became prime minister, was, of course, they were on kibbutzes and all that stuff, but he was a history teacher. And he wrote a book along with the guy who became the first president of Israel, where he basically laid out the fact that the Palestinians that were in the land when they came back into the land then, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, many of them were descendants of ancient Israel. And that because when the Muslims, after the Crusades and stuff, took over the land, they basically put a tax upon the people that either they had to pay the tax or they had to convert. And so for people who believed in the promise of Abraham and that this was the promised land, the land was important. They didn't want to give it up. So they converted. And so, I mean, he writes in his book that amidst several of the Palestinians are really distant descendants of ancient Israel after the Romans and stuff, wiped out everything and took off. People still hung onto the land. So, and then of course you have a whole thing about, there's a couple times I think in the book of Revelation that speaks about, we talk about the verses that say not all those who say they're Israel are Israel's, but what about with the verses where it says not all those that say they're Jews are Jews? So there's a whole thing out there about really the people who are calling themselves Jews in Israel today are not really Jews.
You also have the Samaritans. You still have some left over, the Samaritans, and they claim they're various different times, depending on what part of history you're in, they'll claim they're descendant of Israel. So yeah, that's not new. That's not new but that tells us that in Torah too, is that when they go into exile, they're going to be scattered completely into the nations. We're not going to know who they all are. We're not going to know who everybody is. And
right.
And, that's part of it.
Well, I think too, if you think about like in Israel today, there's basically two sects of Jews. There's Ashkenazis and the Sephardic. And if you go look into some history on the Ashkenazis, they basically are descendants from the Khazars. And the Khazars were people who were up in the area, like in the mountains. I'm not sure if the Kurds and stuff would be them, but up in that area, north of Syria, north of Iraq, up into the mountainous areas around that area. They're the Khazars, and they were in, and if you think about it, where does the name Caucasians come from? It's the Caucasus Mountains and things are from that. And so, is it possible that maybe a lot of the Jews that are there now are not Jews per se, in terms of descending of real Judah. That doesn't mean that they still can't be believers. But I'm just saying, is it possible they're not really even the Jews? And that's what that's talking about.
I don't think that's what Revelation 2 is talking about in verse 9. Although my friend, the late Mike Waters, I said a long time ago that the Khazars, they did not become Jews until 900 AD.
Right.
And they were actually Turks. And well, he said that they really were Jews. But anyway, the way that the word is used here, this is before the word Christian was in common usage. And Paul mentioned this in Romans 2:29, but he who is a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, in the spirit, and not of the letter. Well, the way that Paul used the word Jew and the way that John used the word Jew in Revelation 2:9, he thought that Christians were the real Jews. And there's people that call themselves Jews, but now this is like, you got to remember this before the term Christian.
Right.
That's the only way you can understand this.
So, yeah. And so you go to the name Judah. What does that mean? It means praisers of Yah. And so if you think about that, who are the real praisers of Yah? Who are the ones who really follow Yah and follow his Torah? The Jews in Israel today don't really follow Torah. They follow the oral Torah. They follow the Talmud. Now, not to say that there aren't some who really do follow the Torah, but they most, I think, follow after the rabbinic traditions and follow after the Talmud and that type of stuff. So are they really? I don't know. It's God's going to sort it all out. You'll let us know.
Well, okay, now here's another thing that I wanted to bring up, is that there's a lot of people that think that Israel is holy land and the Jews are the holy people, and they want to move to Israel and they want to dress up like rabbis and they want to learn Hebrew and all this stuff, but Israel is going to be overrun by its enemies, and I don't see why people that hate Yeshua are holy people. That never made sense to me.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of, I mean, I think we're all learning new things and he's giving us more insights and things. Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, I think a lot of people think that when these nations come against Israel, Yah is going to step in and destroy them. Well, at some point, yeah, but I also read the verses that you're talking about where Israel is basically overrun. And so what Israel is, is which, is he talking to there?
Well-
I also think you got the issue with, I mean, I don't know if any of you guys have looked into this kind of controversy about maybe that the Temple Mount was really not where the temple was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Has anybody heard of that?
I've heard of it. I don't know. It's interesting, but I can't. I don't know enough information to make a call one way or the other.
Yeah. So it's interesting because this started with a book that was written quite a long time ago by somebody out of Worldwide called Dr. Ernest Martin.
I read that book, 1994, or the place of the location of the new third temple. It was an excellent book. He was saying, he wasn't saying that the temple was not on Mount Moriah. He was saying that the next temple will be on the Mount of Olives, and he was basing it on Ezekiel 11 and Zechariah 14:7. Now it says specifically, Zechariah 14:7, that the Messiah is going to stand on the Mount of Olives. He's not going to the Mount Moriah. And that site was defiled twice. It was defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes in 164 BC. It was defiled again by the Romans in 70 AD. And I guess in both cases, they sacrificed a pig on the altar.
Right.
And he's going to move the Temple Mount to the Mount of Olives. But he's not saying that there never was a temple on Mount Moriah. He's also saying that the foundation of the wall that is there right now was not really the wall of the temple. It's the wall of Fort Antonius, which was built by the Romans in the late 1st century AD.
Well, what he does mention is that because if you've got that book, there was like a little diagram in the book that came out and showed that Fortress Antonio is basically where the Temple Mount was, what they call now the Temple Mount, and that the actual temple was actually further south on the north end of the old city of the city of David.
Yeah,
That was connected down. So what is now called the Temple Mount was actually the platform that the Fortress Antonio was on.
right. And he was
Yeah.
also saying that the Dome of the Rock is not on the side of the Holy of Holies.
Right, exactly. Because he's saying that the Holy of Holies was actually further to the south of that,
Yeah,
down further. So his book and his information has been picked up on by a bunch of other new people now, who have studied more into all this. But I mean, even he quotes from Josephus and from several other ancient writers and things like that, even like some early New Testament type people who said, that's not where the temple was at. The temple was further down, and that Mount Zion basically got knocked down and destroyed because of the sacrificing of the pigs and the desecration of the temple, that they just wiped that down to the bedrock basically and took that all away.
right.
And
And
some,
Mark was a brilliant guy.
some of the archaeological digs that when we've been to Israel here lately, it's really interesting because the first time I went to Israel, across from the old city of David, there was a parking lot. Well, that parking lot is not any longer there because they've dug way, way down. And they actually found a signet ring where they would like impress into a seal, onto like the back of an envelope or something. And it is one of the guys who's like a servant to one of the kings, and his name is actually mentioned in the Old Testament. And that's
the servant of Hezekiah. Yep.
Yep.
I know which one you're talking
And so that was found just to the west of where they think maybe the temple used to be standing. Now, the Jews aren't really talking about this too much, of course, because they still, their whole doctrine and their whole thinking is that the temple was up on the Temple Mount. But it's just interesting, some of this stuff that's coming out. I just, he goes through, and some of the newer guys that are picking up on this, if you take about where the Temple Mount is currently, what they call the Temple Mount, it's about 35 acres and kind of a weird trapezoidal shape. But they said that's pretty much the common size for any Roman fortress where they have found ruins of those, even down like around the base of Masada. The main encampment was about that exact same size. And you can still see the outline of that with some rocks and stuff that are there. They've also found other encampments like that up in Europe and things like that, where this is where, where they would have one of their thing stations. So there's a lot of evidence to that. I'm unsure, but it would seem weird though, that if, let's say, all of this is coming to pass and the Jews get, through some treaty, get half of the Temple Mount or a portion of the Temple Mount to build an altar and put up some kind of a structure so they can do the sacrifices, and it ends up being in the wrong place.
They've made false temples elsewhere in the wrong places before.
Well, yeah, we talked
Turpentine and what have you.
Yeah. We talked about that after the split of the two kingdoms. What did Jeroboam do? Put up false stuff. But I agree with your point, Mike, about Mount Val as a possibility there, because I think there's also some, I don't know if that's in scripture or if it's in some writings that talk about that when the Babylons were going to, before the Babylons burned down Jerusalem and stuff, it was like the presence of the Holy Spirit left out of the temple, and went over onto the Mount of Olives. And there's quite a bit of writing, even in the New Testament era, that a lot of the believers would meet on the Mount of Olives, that they thought that was the place. Even there's some of the ancient church fathers, that wrote like in 300 and 400 AD that was thought to be the place. And really, even is it in Hebrews where it talks about that there's an altar that's outside the camp that they who are in the camp have no right to be at, kind of alluding to maybe the Levites and those, that this is a different altar that they have no right to be at. So yeah, I think that's and
What you're
then
referring to.
if you really think that the temple is really the body and not a physical temple,
Right, right.
why
No,
would you set something up to do under the Levitical system to do morning and evening sacrifices again?
yes, I think that's set when it talks about a lot of people are thinking that there's going to be a temple and a sacrificial system and a Levitical priesthood before the return of Christ. I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's already been fulfilled in the Daniel 9 prophecy where the sacrifice would be cut off in the middle of the week. I think that was a messianic prophecy. And when there is a temple, it'll be on the Mount of Olives, not on Mount Moriah.
So I don't know if have you heard of a guy by the name of Matthew Nolan?
No.
He's a group.
I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to say it was a great message, Mr. Bensinger, but I got to roll. I hope you guys have a good Sabbath.
Please don't call me Mr. Bensinger. That's my dad.
I heard you. I heard that.
Dennis, it was great to hear you. Thanks for
Take
your
care,
input.
everyone.
All right, Dennis, take care.
Good night, Don.
Thanks for tuning in.
So he has a group he actually does a presentation every week, but the group is called Toward of the Tribes if you go to the website. But he does an interesting little piece on Daniel's prophecy. And I'm not sure what I think about it. I got to do some more studying into it, but he's basically saying that what Daniel's talking about there about the morning and evening sacrifices, where it talks about that the morning and evening sacrifices will be stopped or will be taken down or whatever. He says the language that's used there is actually in the Hebrew means to build up. And he says that same phrase and terminology is used by Daniel like 8 or 9 other times in the book of Daniel. And it always means to lift up or to build up or to raise up. And so his thought on that is kind of like along the lines with you, is that this is already fulfilled. So is the abomination of desolation really when they raise up the morning and evening sacrifices versus when they are stopped and taken down? That the abomination of desolation is really the abomination against Yeshua having already fulfilled this. And now this is an abomination that they would go back to doing that. Because, in one sense, he makes a promise about that there would always be Levitical priests serving him. But if you look in the book of Ezekiel, it's a very specific group. It's called the sons of Zadok. And so what priesthood are we supposed to be under? Messiah is part of a Melchizedek priesthood. He's not part of the Levitical priesthood.
Mm-hmm.
So why would we be looking to the Levitical priesthood that maybe is building an altar on a false place and raising up sacrifices that were already fulfilled by Messiah? Wouldn't maybe that be the abomination of desolation? Just a thought.
Yeah.
Are we talking about Daniel 9?
Yeah.
Oh, I got a whole redoing of Daniel 9. Again, Mike studying. And there it says, we've always interpreted it as when you see the abomination, it makes desolate in the most holy place. It's actually some words are mixed around. And when they did the translation, Mike was claiming that they went from Messianic to Septuagint to Messianic the Septuagint on the interpretation. And actually, it's when you see the abomination made desolate in the most holy place, meaning Christ crucified. He's desolate. The Spirit goes inside, he's desolate. It's an abomination to be nailed to the tree and making desolate. It was the way it was translated. So that's why he was trying to say Daniel 9 is talking about the Messiah. All of a sudden they say, oh, it's this evil person. Then it goes back to the Messiah again. And he's saying, no, it's talking Messiah all the way through. It was the way they translated it and the source of the translation. So I'll just throw that in the ring since we're talking about stuff. And we were talking that, Matthew 24 is actually talking about Daniel 11, not Daniel 9. So I'm throwing that in the ring there for everyone to consider or think about.